But I was really surprised to learn that onshore oil spills, when a pipeline leaks, did occur, could be voluminous, huge amounts of oil, and
Mhm.
apparently occurred really frequently. The larger this system got, the further it traveled, the more likely you would have spills, and that there had been no evidence of any oil system, oil transportation system in Canada that didn't result in oil spills. So oil spills were kind of a baked in cost of operation. There was even one case in which an exposed part of a pipeline was struck by lightning, caused an oil spill. If you're shipping 1 million barrels of oil a day, a
Mm.
10th of a % of 1 million barrels of oil a day is hundreds of millions of liters of oil spilling
Oof.
into the environment, right? So even a
Yeah.
fractional failure rate can create substantial environmental risk, impacts on wildlife, effects on agricultural land, risks for adjacent communities from ignition from fire or damage to property. It was a really large oil spill in Abbotsford. It was in the early 2000s. And again, like years before that, there had been claims that, pipeline development and technology and monitoring technology and computers were going to solve all of this. Regardless of whatever kind of technological improvement that's going to happen, there is such a vast diversity of unexpected things. Technology just hasn't been a silver bullet, and there has never been a leak-proof oil system.
Welcome to another episode of the Environment in Canada podcast, a podcast about the environment in Canada by Sierra Club Canada. I'm Jessica Murray, Sierra Club Canada's Line 5 community organizer, and I'm part of a cross-border effort to protect our Great Lakes from a devastating oil spill. To learn more about Line 5, follow us at Sierra Club Ontario on Instagram and join the movement to safeguard the largest freshwater source on our planet. You can also connect with me every other week on Zoom, where I co-host a 1-hour community building space and podcast club. Following the podcast, We Are the Great Turning. Feel free to check out the episode with Sally Ludwig and the work that reconnects, and email ontario@sierraclub.ca for more information. Today, I'm talking with Sean Courage, an environmental historian that is an associate professor at Toronto Metropolitan University. Sean's current research looks at the social and environmental consequences of the development and operation of oil pipelines in Canada and really highlights the time between 1947 and the 1970s. His research spotlights federally regulated pipelines in Canada. Today, we talk about Canada's history with pipelines, Line 5, and Sean's perspectives on a just transition towards a viable and sustainable future. Before we begin, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, YouTube, or wherever else you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM, bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Don't forget to follow or subscribe so you can get the latest episodes from us. Hello, Sean, and welcome to the Environment in Canada podcast with Sierra Club Canada. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
I'm very excited for you to be here, especially as your projects and your work really guide and help me understand the context of my own work, being a community organizer for Line
Mhm.
5. Huge topic as to the history of pipelines in Canada. So I'm
Mhm.
very excited to speak with you as well. So yeah, I wanted to start off just with sharing with our listeners, who are you? How would you self-describe
Sure.
yourself?
Well, my name's Sean Courage. I'm an associate professor of Canadian and environmental history at Toronto Metropolitan University. And my research focuses on the history of the development of long distance oil pipelines in Canada since about the mid 20th century to about the end of the 20th century.
That's a big part of time, and yeah, that's exciting. I know that you've also, so two things that really jumped out for me, just kind of looking over some of your work, is that I think some of your research, and correct me if I'm wrong, you created a spill database for the Canadian Energy Regulator. So that really gives us a map to look at
Mhm.
the Enbridge system, and I think also the spills in there.
Yes, yeah, we have a couple of things. So we published a map of oil spills that occurred along the Enbridge system, which used to be called the Interprovincial Pipeline System, in
Hmm.
Canada. And that map covers a time period from about the early 1960s to the 1990s. And it is based on reports that the company had to complete when there were oil spill incidents on the pipeline and submit to the national regulator for oil pipelines that cross international and interprovincial boundaries in Canada. And at the time, that was the National Energy Board, which was renamed Canada Energy Regulator a couple of years ago. There's also a database that has all oil spills on federally regulated oil pipelines in Canada from the early 1960s to the mid 1990s.
Is this all publicly available?
It is. Yeah, the data is from the National Energy Board Library or Canada Energy Regulator Library. And so we got access to it, digitized it, mapped it, and then published it on our website.
Amazing. So the other website that I quite enjoy looking through is a project called Silent Rivers. Is that also connected to what we've done here?
Yes, yeah, it's all part of that project. So the project is
Okay.
a broader history of pipeline development. Part of it is looking at environmental effects of oil pipelines in Canada in the 20th century and the regulation of those pipelines. And so part of that project included reviewing and analyzing these pipeline incidents, including oil spills and explosions and accidents. And these databases that we published are focused on oil spills.
Amazing. So I'm just going to plug it in for our listeners here. If you're interested in searching that up, I mean, I'm not actually sure how I stumbled upon Silent Rivers, but it is out there. So if you're looking for the link, we'll provide it into the little summary. But it's niche-canada.org/silent rivers backsplash. And Silent Rivers of Oil, a history of oil pipelines in Canada since 1947. So before we dive into that, I really wanted to kind of situate us as to kind of understand the importance of environmental historian work. Because I think as a young person, and partly I'm going to blame my teacher because I did not find like the love of history that now as an adult I am far more fascinated and can have a really deeper understanding of the importance of its role. So I'm curious to know how that lands with you and kind of your understanding as your role as an environmental historian. Is that right?
Hmm.
Environmental historian.
Hmm. Yep.
Okay, good. Good.
Sure. Yeah. So I think there were a few things that drew me to the field. So it's a sub-discipline of history. So you probably wouldn't encounter it in high school, and
This
but
is true.
probably not until university, as you might specialize more. So what drew me was this convergence of two interests, one in the environment and the other in studies of the past, and how those two things intersect. So I was particularly interested in the ways in which nature, forces beyond human control, have an effect on choices and decisions that people can make and what the implications of that are for history. So, most historical scholarship is focused on human agency, what choices and decisions people make, and how they affect the lives of people, the economies, the societies that they live in. But
Mm.
there are these whole host of other factors that shape the choices and decisions that we make that are beyond our control. Things like gravity, things like the atmosphere, plants, animals, geology, volcanoes, hydrology, meteorology. There are all of these aspects of the natural world that are outside of our control, but that set parameters or limits on the decisions that we make. And then even within the context of the decisions that people make over time and how they affect societies and economies, there are unintended outcomes of those decisions. And that was something that I found in what I was studying as a historian, that there were several instances in which the intended outcome or the choices that people made resulted in a bunch of unintended outcomes. And I thought you could understand that from an environmental perspective by thinking about the ways in which natural and cultural agency interacts to shape history. And so that brought me to a number of research projects that I've done on parks, on urban animals, and now on oil and oil pipeline development.
Do you have like a mini story of a kind of like concrete example that listeners can kind of understand that concept applied in real life?
Probably like an early one that drew my attention to this field and as a way of thinking about the past differently was a book written by Alfred Crosby on the 1918 influenza epidemic and the effects that it had on American society. It was a book on in U.S. history, and it was a period of American history that I was familiar with, but it was an episode I didn't know anything about. So this is the interwar period, end of the First World War, prior to the Great Depression, and yet I had never read in any of my other studies of history anything about this epidemic that killed millions of people, was a global phenomenon, changed economies and societies, was highly disruptive, and yet it was like the book describes it as the forgotten pandemic of American history. And then it started opening up my mind to thinking about the ways in which non-human phenomenon, natural phenomenon can shape events in the past, can disrupt the decisions and choices that we can make, and that we might not be getting a full appreciation of past events and a full understanding of what affects past events without taking into consideration the ways in which natural phenomenon interact with human choices, cultures, and societies.
Yeah, it almost like the kind of image that I get is that maybe outside of the realm of environmental historian work, like humans are seen as this like in this silo of like, what are the humans doing?
Yeah.
Whereas your field kind of opens up to like, there's like a lot of other stuff going on out there that,
Yes. Yeah.
influences what the humans can do.
Yeah, and
So,
it also asks what are the effects of what humans do on the non-human world. So
mm,
um, we we can look in the 20th century at the popularization of the automobile,
mhm.
and there's lots of scholarship on its effects on cities and how cities change through road and highway construction. There's lots of scholarship on the economic effects of automobility, but not as much on the effects on the atmosphere. There's some research, obviously, on urban pollution, but it's a piece of understanding the history of climate change. And so that's another way in which environmental history can broaden our understanding about the past, in addition to thinking about the ways in which the natural world sets constraints or affects the choices that we make, also gives us space to think about the ways in which human choices affect the natural world.
Right. And that's becoming ever more relevant in our lives, considering just the increasing severity and frequency of really unnatural extreme weather.
Yeah, that's right. And I think the challenging piece to all of this is the degree to which so much of nature is affected by human activity and behavior. So there was a period in the past, in the mid 19th century, right up into the 20th century, that people debated whether or not humanity could have such a profound effect on the environment. So if we go back all the way to like Henry David Thoreau, writing about Walden Pond and pondering the ways in which human activity was changing the natural environment up to the present, I don't think anyone would contest the idea that human activity has an effect on the environment. But in the 19th century, it was debatable and uncertain and unclear, but becoming more certain and clear every day.
Yes, well, I'm glad that we're at a point where I think we understand that a little bit more clearly now. Yeah. I wanted to actually touch on one more wee topic before we kind of dive into more understanding like the history of pipelines in Canada.
Mhm.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but your last name suggests to me that maybe you're from somewhere beyond Canada's borders, or at least part of you is. What's your
It comes from my dad's side of the family and where
okay,
he's
so
from. Yeah.
and where is he from?
East Africa.
Okay,
Yeah.
gotcha. And why I asked is because I am curious about how, in a lot of different fields now, there's a question of Jedi work. So justice, equity, diversity, inclusion. And I'm
Mhm.
curious to know that in the field of historians, whether that's a space that is dominated by either white or male narratives, and or if and when BIPOC folk come in and begin to do their own research, like what does that landscape look like? Because I've had conversations with close friends where it's like, oh, like that's a non-issue, like it's objective, so like, a lot of this is like this like race stuff is not applicable to the world of historians. And I'm just curious to know what your take is on that, the realm of like historian work.
It's
Okay.
history is an extremely diverse field of study in Canada and the United States. So it's almost impossible to make any statement about historical scholarship that's sort of sweeping, that captures everything. It's such a diverse study. You've got national fields, you've got thematic fields. There's studies of the history of capitalism, studies of the history of race, studies of the history of gender. So the field, I mean, this is before I even went to university, this was already diversifying quite considerably. In terms of representation in the field, it depends. Depends on the institution. It depends on the subdiscipline and subfield of how diverse the representation is among the scholars and researchers in that field from one field to the next. Probably not as widely representative as some other areas of scholarship, I'd say, but it's a pretty diverse field. So lots of work on settler colonialism and decolonization, lots of work on history of race and ethnicity, and lots of work on history of gender, all of which has also been shaping environmental history scholarship as well.
Mm-hmm.
And the most explicit space in which that occurs is in histories of environmental justice, more recent work on settler colonialism and environmental history and the relationship between settler resource exploitation and the impacts on Indigenous communities, at least in the Canadian context, but there's scholarship in the US as well on that.
There's different schools of thought in terms of understanding our world, right? So I guess I'm curious to know where you fall on this, but are there ever like studies where people almost like disagree on the objective facts based on like who the researcher or historian is, based on their lived experience, based on their lineage? Or do you find that consensus is not that difficult to come to in terms of in this field?
Yeah, like I said, it depends on the subfields. There are hundreds of subfields of history. So anything that I would say
Gotcha.
for one may not be true for another. So,
Yeah.
like, gender historians will have their own debates and arguments within that subfield. Environmental historians will, Canadian environmental historians will. So it's far too diverse to be able to say one way or
Yes or no?
another. In terms of like debates based on the identity of the scholar. Yes, I think maybe, but I can't think of like a specific example. I think that would fit. Probably where, at least in Canadian history, I think some of the more contentious disagreements have been over, and I don't even really know if it's fair to say it's contentious because there's quite a lot of consensus, sort of reinterpretation of Canadian history through a settler colonial lens. So understanding the history of
Interesting.
Canada and the history of the displacement and dispersal of Indigenous peoples across the country, and its varying effects. And that has, I think, I mean, it's provoked some disagreement on interpretation, less on facts.
Mm.
I think, yeah.
Right. Okay. Interesting. So that does help me kind of understand the picture that as work is being conducted in about history, that it's a very alive process. It's not like these are the facts, this is what happened, done, move on.
Oh, yes, yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Okay, cool. That's all very good to know because I think at least my understanding of like facts and reality is that there's just so many different realities that can coexist at the same time. It can be kind of confusing as to nailing it down. Like I think sometimes we have this impulse, nail it down. This is what happened, and that's it. My
Well, I
personal
think in at least
curiosity.
in the Canadian history field, the bigger problem is, I mean, there's obviously debates on interpretation about the past. The bigger difficulty is sufficient exploration of periods of time and issues.
Right.
So it's not an enormous field. There aren't that many professional historians of Canada. And so there are subject areas that are just unexamined.
Right.
So in the work that I'm doing on these federally regulated oil pipelines, there are collections of records that I'm acquiring through our national archives that have never been analyzed by a researcher before. So they are in boxes, literally in the exact same spot they were when someone from the National Energy Board put them in a folder, dropped them in a box, and delivered them to the National Archives. And it's the first time anyone's opened them since they were deposited in the archives. And that is a function of just limited research capacity to be able to
Right.
explore these different aspects. So what ends up happening is then we add more pieces to the puzzle. And as we do that, it gives us a broader and clear understanding of what the bigger picture is. And then that's where we're able to have new debates about interpreting Canadian history.
Like it would require a human to be interested in a topic and
Yeah,
then
yeah,
look at a bunch of data and then come out with some sort of interpretation.
yeah, that's right. I mean,
Gotcha.
in a
Okay.
lot of cases in Canadian history, there just hasn't been anyone else who has studied that topic. And so it's, someone is doing this for the first time. Like I think there's a really good book by a colleague at in Manitoba on fast food in Canada, and there's not a lot of history of fast food in Canada. Another colleague from University of Toronto published a book on the history of the donut in Canada. There isn't another history of the donut in Canada, so there wasn't really like an existing group of donut historians who were really upset about his interpretations of donut history.
Love that. It'd be like in their email signature, like name donut historian.
Yeah.
I love that. Okay, so let's turn back time together and take us back to, I don't know, I guess because it sounds like you start around like in the early 1900s, but I think a large bulk of your research is kind of in that pocket of 1950s to 1970s. But my
Mhm.
point is, like, can you offer us, I know this is like a whole body of work and we have
Mhm.
like,
Mhm.
like however much time left. So a snack size,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, rundown
So
of like what happened.
maybe a good place to start would be 1947. So
Yeah.
it's just a couple of years after the end of the Second World War. Economies around the world, especially among the Allied powers, are in reconstruction, rebuilding of their economies. And in 1947, it's interesting to think about where Canadians were getting oil from. And depending on where in the country you lived, it was a different place, just as it is today to a certain extent. So if you lived in British Columbia in 1947, and you were filling up gasoline at a fuel station, the crude oil that was refined to manufacture that gasoline probably came from California. And if you lived in Montreal, that gasoline was probably refined from crude oil that came from Venezuela or Saudi Arabia, maybe. And if you lived in Ontario, you were probably getting oil either from Texas or imported oil from overseas somewhere else. And then after 1947, that started to change when Imperial Oil made its strikes of enormous crude oil deposits near Leduc, which is outside of Edmonton. And this became the beginning of, depending on how many oil booms you count, the third oil boom in Canadian history, but the largest. So this is the beginning of the modernization of Canada's energy economy towards high energy fossil fuels. As the discovery of the oil in this part of the country eventually led to a nationalization, maybe that's not the right word to use, but eventually shifted most of the oil consumption in Western Canada from imported oil to domestic sources of oil. For me as a historian, what's interesting about this is the story that I think helps us to understand modern Canada and helps us to understand where, at least a part of how we arrived in our current state in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. So oil isn't obviously the only source of greenhouse gas emissions. Someone else can go study natural gas, someone else can go study methane, but carbon emissions from the burning of oil constituted at least a third of the greenhouse gas emissions in Canada in the period from 1950 to the end of the 20th century and into the 21st century. And so I thought that to understand that, I need to go back to where this began. And though there are precursors to that, the real period of growth of our oil consumption starts in the late 1940s, and it starts in Alberta in this period. And so the other thing to think about in this period of time is then how did Canadians actually get this oil if it was located in Edmonton, outside of Edmonton, in an agricultural area outside of Edmonton? How did consumers in Toronto, which by the 1960s was a rapidly growing urban region with highways being built and suburbs being extended and new manufacturing and industrialization, how did they get access to that oil resource? So I wanted to go to kind of the keystone infrastructure of this energy transition that occurred, which are these enormous pipeline systems that ship billions of liters of oil across the country every day.
Mm-hmm.
And so in 1947, there were none. And by 1970, there was the largest oil pipeline transportation system in the world. And it spanned the country from Edmonton all the way by 1977 to Montreal, and in the other direction from Edmonton to Burnaby on the coast of British Columbia.
Thanks for laying that out. Yeah. And so a couple things came up as you were sharing that. I think it's really helpful to kind of understand what life was like before that, and then what quickly escalated into what you named as kind of modernity and modern life as it is. So can you paint a picture of that for us? Because I think it's really easy, like in this day and age, especially in the world of climate activism, that we kind of look at it as this like demonic, awful, bad, and really I find when I listen to what you're saying, it's like, it's so much more understandable. Like, yeah, like how could have we not done that? You know what I mean? And like, oh,
yeah,
we are all a part of that.
I think the period of time to look at, if you're interested in understanding predecessors who made these choices, right? Like you look at the oil pipeline system in 77, even by 1977, and you might kind of put your hands on your head and just think, oh my gosh, how did this happen? Who made these decisions? This is such a huge environmental footprint. But the period from 1950 to 1970, I think, is really critical because that is the period of the fastest growth in the consumption of oil in Canadian history. I think it's something like a 900% growth in petajoule consumption of energy from crude oil from 1950 to 1970. So this is just like a huge spike. So some historians describe this period as the Great Acceleration. And part of that is from an energy history perspective, a whole series of what you might describe as modern fuel sources, so high energy fossil fuel sources as well as nuclear power, all go through this sort of hockey stick massive growth from 1950 to 1970. And it's mind-boggling to try to imagine what the world in 1950 felt like compared to the world in 1970. So some of the things that you might take from that would be that if you were a Canadian in 1950, over the course of your life, traveled a lot less. There's a historian at Western University, Alan McEachern, who wrote a great short article, web article about comparing his air travel to his grandfather's air travel over his grandfather's lifetime. And he calculated the mileage of the distance that he had traveled in his lifetime to that point and the distance that his grandfather had traveled. And his grandfather's distance, like his total, like if you put him on Google Maps and had everywhere he went in his life, is a fraction of what a person in the 21st century travels. So that would be one major difference that we would recognize. There'd also probably be differences in the heat in your home. So how you heated your home, if you were getting fuel oil versus using coal, which would have been probably the most coal or wood for heating a home in a city. Montreal, even by 1950, was still consuming considerable amounts of fuel wood to heat homes. And so the modern conveniences that come from having a liquid oil source for heating a home and then later natural gas, which is actually more important for heating homes, that would have had a profound impact on your life. The ability to drive a car and the cost of driving a car. So driving a car for the 1950s in Canada was less common and expensive. Another one would be the mechanization of agriculture. So by the late 1940s, early 1950s, most Canadian farms still weren't mechanized. They were still using draft animal labor. So the scale of agriculture, pretty different. So those would be some of the main ones. You got your air travel, you got your automobile travel, you got your mechanization of agriculture, some home heating with fuel oil, all of which just starts to change. And so in that period of time, what you don't have is much mass anxiety about that
Hmm.
900% growth of oil consumption. It's enthusiasm
Yeah,
that
I'm
this
sure.
is going to make your life better. It will
Hmm.
be more affordable. You'll be
Hmm.
able to travel more. You'll be able to move faster. You'll be warmer and you'll be richer.
Hmm. Hmm. And, coming from a family that experienced like pretty extreme levels of poverty
Hmm.
in China and Hong Kong, that was a huge deal. Like I
Yeah.
like I look back at my parents and I'm like, yeah, of course you embraced this. Like
Yeah.
your body, your cells like
Yeah.
understood
Yeah.
real suffering that what I cannot understand.
Yeah.
So there's a lot more understanding and compassion when you kind of look back at it in
Although
that
with,
way.
with that said, on the one hand, you have the desire to modernize and to get all of the benefits, perceived benefits of prosperity that came with huge amounts of cheap energy. But on the other hand, the market for that was being created
There's
because
also that.
there was wealth to be extracted from that. So you do have a couple of forces here. You have the kind of
Hmm.
consumer desire to get access to this, but that market is being generated by the producers of oil and the system to transport it and deliver it to consumers. And so as oil becomes cheaper, it's made cheaper by these transportation systems. And so people are just awash in it by the 1950s and 1960s that they can just
Hmm.
consume more and more and more and more. And there's a market incentive for the companies that are extracting the oil and transporting the oil because they see, this is money. This is a huge financial opportunity. And so these two forces are working together to lead to this massive acceleration of oil consumption. So I'll give a few stats of how fast this grew in Canada on the Enbridge system as an example, which is relevant to your work. So in
Hmm.
1950, the first segment of the Enbridge system was completed. By the end of 1950, it traveled from Edmonton all the way to Wisconsin to the town of Superior. And then
Hmm.
oil would be shipped by tankers over the Great Lakes to Sarnia, which was the main refinery center in southern Ontario. The capacity of that pipeline in 1950 was 35,000 barrels of oil a day, and it
Hmm.
was 1,812 kilometers long. 3 years later,
Oh wow. Not
Line
even that
5 is
far.
built, and it travels through Michigan and a little bit of Minnesota and creates a direct connection. It bypasses those Great Lakes tankers, which are slow and more costly. And over that period of 3 years, it grows from 35,000 barrels a day capacity to 180,000 barrel per day capacity.
Oh,
And it
oh
keeps
dear.
growing from there. 1958, it connects directly to Port Credit, which is in Mississauga today, near Toronto. And by that point, it can carry 284,000 barrels of oil per day.
Oh my
By
goodness.
1969, it's got a ton of branches now. It goes to Chicago. It's got a branch off to Chicago. It's got a branch off to Buffalo, and it carries 604,000 barrels of oil per day by 1969. And its total distance was 8,266 kilometers.
Oh my
And by
goodness.
1977, when it reached its apex, at least in that period of growth, it extended all the way to Montreal. It traveled 9,983 kilometers, and it could carry 902,000 barrels of oil per day, almost a million
Wow.
barrels of oil per day. And it grew
Oh my
bigger after
goodness.
that. So
Wow.
the scale of what was happening, that infrastructure is what made oil cheap for consumers. And it's what mobilized it and got it out of a region that was primarily agricultural and could not consume a million barrels of oil per day to the places where it could be consumed.
Oh man, those numbers are dizzying, truly. Okay. So I think in some of the work that I've looked at that you've shared with the public is kind of more information about how these pipelines work, and I think clarifying just the reality of the likelihood of spills.
Yeah, I mean, so I was interested in oil spills. That was part of what drew me to the research. I had been living in Alberta when I first started this project, and there had been a big oil spill in the north. And I remembered the environment minister in the province made some remark about how, these kinds of accidents are very rare. And so I just started doing newspaper research to see, like, okay, well, when was the last time there was a big onshore oil spill? I had also not really thought about this. Like, I think popularly, certainly in the 1980s and the 1990s, offshore oil spills. And by 2010, if you think about Deepwater Horizon, offshore oil spills were really what drove media attention, in part because it could have this, much broader geographic impact. Affects marine life, bird life, et cetera. But I was really surprised to learn that onshore oil spills, when a pipeline leaks, did occur, could be voluminous, huge amounts of oil, and
Mhm.
apparently occurred really frequently. So,
Ah!
just in the newspaper record, I was finding dozens and dozens of, sometimes a large newspaper article, sometimes just a small mention of like, oh yeah, 7,000 liters of oil escaped from this pipeline in this rural part of Saskatchewan. Wow, that's pretty surprising. And so then I was able to work in the energy regulator's library to get access to these reports, could find reports for every incident of an oil spill on a federally regulated pipeline that was reported to the national regulator. And it's hundreds of oil spills. So to take the interprovincial pipeline system as an example, had, forget what the total is, but from 1962 up to 1996, had over 200 oil spills. They could be of varying sizes in terms of the volume of oil spill, but what became clear is that oil spills weren't rare, they were endemic, and that the larger this system got, the further it traveled, the more likely you would have spills, and that there had been no evidence of any oil transportation system in Canada that didn't result in oil spills. So oil spills were kind of a baked in cost of operation to
Mhm.
these transportation systems, which, as you start to think about the logic of it, makes sense. And if
Mhm.
you're familiar with history of technology and machine failures, then that it makes even more sense, right? There isn't a possibility of having complex envirotechnical machinery that doesn't experience failure in some way. And there is such a breadth of causes of failure, which was also interesting in these reports because they had to report the cause of an oil spill. So there are all
Mhm.
these categories or codes for all the different types. There could be corrosion, internal corrosion, external corrosion. There could be manufacturing defects, weld defects, accidents. There was even one case in which an exposed part of a pipeline was struck by lightning, caused an oil spill. And
Wow.
so you think about that, it starts to become clear that there are so many unpredictable ways in which complex machinery can fail that
Mhm.
you have to expect that there will be some measure of failure that results in spillage of oil. And so, what happened over time in the industry was an effort to improve the engineering as maximally as possible to mitigate or reduce those incidents to such a point that although there were many hundreds of spills on this pipeline, as a percentage of the oil that the pipeline shipped, it was a very small percent of what spilled, less
Mhm.
than a tenth of a percent of the oil
Mhm.
that was successfully delivered on the pipeline system over this period of time actually spilled and released into the environment. However, going back to what I said before, if you're shipping 1 million barrels of oil a day, a
Mhm.
tenth of a percent of 1 million barrels of oil a day is hundreds of millions of liters of oil spilling
Oof.
into the environment, right? So even a
Yeah.
fractional failure rate can create substantial environmental risk.
Because Line 5 travels through the Great Lakes. I'm curious to
Mhm.
know, so we were in Sarnia actually just last week, and of course during the Q&A, there's industry folk that are like, you know what, like this has been, we were, it's ironclad. It was designed in a way that is so safe. And I'm curious to know, has oil spilled into the Great Lakes?
Well, I have bad news on that front. My research, my research is only looking at Canada. So the portion of the pipeline that travels through the Great Lakes, where there's exposure to the Great Lakes, it's
Mm,
not only there, but the main part would be in Michigan, on Lake Michigan, and that segment isn't regulated by the Canadian government; it's regulated by the
gotcha.
U.S.
Okay.
government. So I don't know
Hmm.
for sure if there have been any oil spills along there. There aren't any incidents that I could find on this pipeline of spillage into the Great Lakes, though there would have been spillage via tributaries into probably Lake Ontario, is where you would
Mm,
likely have that, because that would be the only part of the Enbridge system where the pipeline travels adjacent to the Great Lakes in Canada. It's adjacent to the Great Lakes on Superior, Michigan, and Huron on the US side. And then I guess on the Erie side, but it travels pretty far north of Erie. But again, it could go through tributaries. And
mm,
then most of the exposure is in the United States. But
mhm,
there are
mhm.
lots of incidences of oil spills into smaller lakes, streams, and rivers, impacts on wildlife, effects on agricultural land, risks for adjacent communities from ignition from fire or damage to property. And when that system was extended to Montreal, there was considerable anxiety about spillage into drinking water reservoirs. So there was a portion of that extension that was rerouted as it crosses the Ottawa River to avoid a drinking water reservoir that supplied Montreal.
That kind of makes me think about the oil spill in Kalamazoo, which obviously was not in
Hmm.
Canada.
Hmm.
But so one of the Q&A speakers basically said that since Kalamazoo, they've done lots of upgrades and that like pipelines are now safer than ever. I'm curious to know whether you're aware of are there changes in technology and how they're kind of discovering pipeline leaks? Because pipeline is huge. It's not like how
Yeah,
would they figure
yeah.
that out? You know what I mean?
It really depends, right? There's probably been improvements in material sciences on the metallurgy to manufacture the tubing for the pipeline and improvements to welding technologies, and then
Mm,
improvements to what materials companies are now using for wrapping. So when oil pipeline traveled under a body of water, it would that segment would be manufactured differently from the rest of the pipeline. It might have thicker walls,
mhm.
and it might be wrapped in material to be able to mitigate against the spill and reduce corrosion. So there could be improvements there, but unless those segments are being replaced, it doesn't matter, right? So, like, yeah, new pipeline development might use newer technology, but there are still segments of this pipeline system that are original to 1950.
Mhm,
And
mhm,
several of the spills that were included in the reports that I looked at were on original segments that had manufacturing defects that went back to the original construction. Because, of course, it's very costly and complicated to completely remove and replace an oil pipeline. And so it just almost never happens. So even
sure.
where you might have improvements, you're still going to have segments that are old on there. And unless that segment in Kalamazoo is completely ripped out and replaced with brand new manufactured equipment, you're not going to get those benefits. And then on top of that, what happened in the past isn't necessarily a roadmap for what's going to happen in the future, but it can give you some insights to possibilities. And there were certainly plenty of episodes in the past during periods of high frequencies of oil spills, especially in the 1970s, in which companies made claims about improved technology. Significant improvements in technology are going to reduce the incidents that we're gonna experience here. We shouldn't worry now because the pipelines are safer than ever. Then there's more spills that happen.
Yeah.
The one that really comes to mind is one that happened in Abbotsford on the Trans Mountain Pipeline, which goes in the other direction. was a really large oil spill in Abbotsford. It was in the early 2000s. And again, like years before that, there had been claims that, pipeline development and technology and monitoring technology and computers were going to solve all of this. And it was a segment of the pipeline that was original to 1953. And it broke because there had been a landfill that was built on top of it. Over time, the weight of the landfill had compressed the soil and then crushed the pipeline underneath it, and then it burst underneath and leaked. So regardless of whatever kind of technological improvement that's going to happen, there is such a vast diversity of unexpected things, right? That to be able to mitigate that, they would have had to have known to set regulations for what could be built on top of a right of way. They would have had to have more accurate understanding of where the pipeline was, because they didn't have GPS in 1953 when that pipeline was built. And so the mapping could be approximate. And so then you place a landfill on top of it by mistake. And at the time, they didn't know that a landfill could grow so large and heavy that it could compress the soil and crush the pipeline. And all of that would have required 30, 40, 50 years of foresight to be able to account for that. And technological development can't do that. And it's unexpected things that I think create problems. And so that I don't disagree that technological improvement has reduced the spillage, but I don't think it's reduced the frequency. The frequency is much more sporadic. It doesn't follow a consistent pattern. There is a little bit of a growth pattern into the 1970s based on like just surface area of how large the pipeline systems are, but technology just hasn't been a silver bullet, and there has never been a leak-proof oil pipeline system.
There has never been a leak-proof oil system.
That is correct.
If you're going to take anything away, that is what you will take away.
That's the one thing you can take away. I mean, it's leak proof after the last leak until the next one.
Okay, right. And so my other thought as you're speaking is that, sure, we could go in and replace all of these pipelines, but, we're also looking at like, should we be doing that at this given point, right? So leaks obviously are incredibly damaging to the environment and the communities that live by those leaks. But at the end of the day, it's like, can we continue to burn these fossil fuels that and it's expensive to replace those pipelines, and that commits us to X number of years, which would either slow down or even preclude a proper just transition. So I kind of want to, in the last 5 minutes we have, kind of just get your rough thoughts about where are we going? Like, how does this fit into just transition, and just anything that kind of is really alive for you right now?
So I think this is a really good point. Oil spills were this immediate environmental impact that I could study historically on oil pipelines and have some sense of one of the environmental effects of oil pipelines. And you're right, they can be environmentally destructive, but they are much more locally environmentally destructive. So the Kalamazoo spill is one of the most environmentally spectacular accidents that had a series of environmental repercussions, but they are largely local to this specific region. So if you look at the thousands of kilometers that this pipeline travels, the folks who live in Hardisty, where there's a pump station in Canada, didn't feel any environmental impact of the Kalamazoo spill. The most significant environmental impact of these pipelines doesn't happen along the routes of the pipelines. It happens in the tailpipes of the cars that burn the oil, and the factories that use the oil as a fuel source. And anywhere else that the oil gets burned, it's the emissions into the atmosphere that have had the most consequential environmental effects historically from the construction of these energy systems. And so that is something that is hard to capture when just looking at the pipelines themselves. And for my own research and thinking about this, it really is the kind of conclusion to the story, right? There were a lot of environmental anxieties about the development of these energy systems, debates and arguments that Canadians and Americans had about these in the past. But the longer term effect was the atmospheric consequences. And so then I worked my way back in thinking about this, and part of it is an argument about keystone infrastructure and energy transitions, that this economic system that was dependent upon high energy fossil fuels was enabled by this keystone infrastructure. We couldn't get to 900% increase in petajoule consumption of crude oil by 1970 without this infrastructure. This enabled it. And that gets right back to the beginning of our conversation about the non-human forces that shape human decisions. We are taking a natural resource, building a sociocultural technological system and wrapping it around it in order to literally flow it out to other people to be able to use. And then it's producing these unintended consequences in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions that they produce. So in thinking about an energy transition and a just energy transition, there could be lessons that are drawn from the way in which transportation infrastructure facilitates energy transitions. And so if we're thinking about electrification of automobiles, then thinking about the energy system that fuels those automobiles is really critical. And I think we're already talking about that and exploring that now, and thinking systemically about how we move to a new energy system. And then the other question is about the kind of lock-in that you get with a large system like this. So, but there's increased pressure to grow these systems. And where these pipelines were built, markets were found, markets were created. And it's a bit like, I don't know if it's a perfect analogy, but it's a bit like adding lanes to a freeway. So, you have a lot of congestion on a highway, and so you want to relieve that congestion, so you build a new lane. But what the new lane does is basically creates a market for more drivers. And so more drivers come onto the highway and it fills up. So if you look at the 401 highway in Toronto, it's something at its widest is 16 lanes and it's jam packed. So now our provincial government wants to build a tunnel underneath it. And we know historically what will likely happen is eventually that tunnel will fill with cars and get jam packed as well. And we can see it on double decker freeways in parts of the United States where that happens. So similarly with oil pipelines, you build a new loop, you build a new parallel line, and a market will be found and created by that. Because it will, reduce the cost of oil and make it cheaper and people can adopt it more easily. And so if you are trying to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, building new lines, building new capacity works against that interest because it makes the resource more available and cheaper. It makes it difficult to switch to an alternate fuel source.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That was a very stimulating conversation and really helpful for me to continue to kind of expand my understanding of some of the work that I do. We're at time, unfortunately, but is there any kind of like final takeaway that you haven't already shared in like the very wonderful long story that we've shared here already?
Yeah.
Like if there was a takeaway.
Yeah, I mean, I guess for activists, right? What's the value of history? I think there's some cautious, limited value in terms of thinking about the past to try to understand where we might go into the future, getting ideas, at least understanding what ideas have been used previously. So I think that can be pretty valuable. But the more valuable piece to it, I think, is understanding how you got to this point. And understanding that the line 5 is part of a legacy. It is part of a legacy of an energy infrastructure system that is a bundle of ideas and thoughts that go everywhere from the boardroom of the company that was trying to generate profits from the construction of this pipeline to the kitchen table of the family that was filling the tank of their car in Mississauga. And so I think that can be helpful for understanding this stuff didn't just get here yesterday. It took time. It was shaped by choices that people made and choices that were constrained by the environments in which they lived.
Well, thank you so much, Sean.
No problem, Jessica. Thanks for having me.
Connor Curtis, Head of Communications at Sierra Club Canada, just jumping in here to do the outro for the podcast and to mention that we have a couple of resources on our page if you're interested in learning more about the economics of oil and gas infrastructure, where we actually delve into why building out more oil and gas infrastructure in Canada is not in the national interest, doesn't make any economic sense from the point of view of benefiting Canadians, and why building out renewable energy instead is a much better option. You can find those links in the podcast description. Before we end today, just a reminder also that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe to get the latest episodes from us.